John C. McManus is Curator's Distinguished Professor of U.S. Military History at Missouri S&T here in Rolla, Missouri. He has authored several books on topics related to the history of World War II. Last year, his book Fire and Fortitude won the Gilder Lehrman Prize for Military History. This November, his book Island Infernos is to be released, which continues where that book left off in a well-researched and skillfully crafted historical narrative about the U.S. Army and the Pacific conflict during World War II. Today, we'll be talking to John about his career as a military historian and how he got started. John, welcome aboard.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Derek. I appreciate it.
So what are some of your significant accomplishments as a military historian?
I don't know. That may be for others to say, not me, but I am pretty proud of the Gilder Lehrman prize that Fire and Fortitude won, because that's a major international, blind reviewed, peer reviewed, competition, and it goes to what is thought of as the absolute best book in military history published that year. So military history is a pretty broad umbrella. I mean, that could take us into ancient Rome. It could take us into modern Afghanistan and everything in between. So that means there's many, many dozens of books that come out in any given year that are going to be eligible for that and considered for it. So I was very pleased with that. On a lot of levels. Obviously, it's good to get that kind of recognition as an historian, but beyond just me, I think it was good to see such a kind of a prestigious awards board recognize the importance of that particular story, the Army in the Pacific, which I think is a really overlooked aspect of World War II, at least from an American perspective. So that's why I've done that series. Fire and Fortitude is just the first of three books in that series, sort of chronicling that story.
Now, you earned a degree in sports journalism, and for a time you worked as in broadcasting and in advertising. What did you like most about that, and what did you like least?
I guess what I liked most about it was the actual sports itself, because I'm kind of a sports nut, and I enjoy that. But that's really, in a way, the wrong reason to go into that, because really in the end, in sports journalism, you're a reporter or you're a producer or whatever. So I would say, as far as what I've enjoyed most in the long term, was that, that field was about communication. It was about taking information and analyzing it and recognizing patterns and being able to explain something coherently and sort of educating in that respect. And I really felt over time, as I was involved in that I could use a lot of those same skills in history. And I felt maybe for a more significant purpose, because what I liked least about about sports broadcasting in that field is that, in a way it was, it was a lot of nepotism, or if you weren't a former athlete, there weren't a lot of opportunities. But even beyond that, and we know this if you watch pregame shows or watch many like baseball broadcasts or hockey or football, whatever you're into. There's a tendency to just kind of gloss over things and try and have happy talk, when, if a team's 30 games under 500, they're really good, or something. And that to me would have bored me over time. Is this, and athletes, of course, are trained to basically tell you nothing while still talking to you. And so that, I think that would have really made me impatient over time, because it did in the short time I was involved. And the other thing that's difficult about journalism, it's often called the first draft of history. And it really is, because you're just kind of trying to get the story on immediately, and you don't necessarily have the perspective, and it's all done under a very unforgiving deadline, especially in the electronic media. And so I think history allows us a much deeper dive and more circumspection and a bit better understanding. And that really appealed to me, is not necessarily being under the gun with some sort of imminent deadline and thus having to kind of go halfway with a story. That with history, you can really get, much deeper into it. And I like that aspect of it.
So did journalism kind of help bring out some skills in terms of storytelling as a historian for you?
Yeah, I think it definitely did. I think it gave me a great advantage in writing skills, in analytical skills, in communication skills. I think it gave me a great advantage in speaking, in presentation, which obviously is a huge part of teaching. and certainly a huge part of research in the sense of making public presentations, giving talks, and which I really enjoy. That aspect of what we do, what so many of us professors do at S&T, giving public talks either to our colleagues or to the general public, whatever it is. Journalism really trained me for a lot of that. So I'm glad I got that degree. But I also, kind of wish that I would have gone into history even sooner, because I just think, that was more what I should have been doing, because, in undergrad, I took any history I could. I loved history, took it, and I really didn't like my journalism classes that much, but I'm a little slow on the uptake. It took me a few years to figure out that maybe I ought to be in history rather than journalism. But it gave me some excellent skills that I think have translated long term.
It's kind of interesting because I heard a statistic. I can't remember the exact number, but a lot of college graduates and undergraduates, they don't end up using the degree they went for, and they end up switching to when they go do their graduate. If they got an undergraduate degree, they'll go, when they do a graduate degree, into something different. So would you have any advice for somebody who's thinking about switching?
Yeah, my advice is always, follow your passion of what you can see yourself doing long term. And I have that conversation a lot with our students, because a lot of students come to S&T to be engineers, and sometimes because they think that's what they're supposed to do, or there's family pressure or something, or that's how they'll get a job or whatever. And that's great, but if you can't see yourself as a mechanical engineer 30 years from now, I don't know why you're doing it now. So I think really you have to follow what is your passion, what you think your strength is, your skills, what you see yourself working as. And you have to also be realistic and understand what that means. That maybe if you're going from electrical engineering to something else, you may not have that immediate job security when you get out, but you also may have broader vistas in your career that takes you places you may never have gone. So I'm usually very much in that column of making sure to do what you think to do, regardless of family pressure, because it's you who's going to be working at this job forever. And if it's something you hate, you don't want to wake up 10, 15, 30 years from now and be sort of trapped in that kind of career path that you don't really like. That happens a lot. And I think it's a shame, because people aren't as happy as they should be. So, for me, it was, a situation of realizing that I didn't really like being in journalism that much. And I didn't really want to work in a kind of a 9-to-5 environment or anything like that. But I realized that studying history was my not just avocation, my passion and my purpose in life. But I also had to realize, the kind of price I would pay to try and make that happen, because it meant, a lot of work and a lot of sacrifice and a lot of dedication. So you kind of have to be willing to sort of pay that price if you have a dream. But I think really it's much better in the long run. I just feel that way. So that is what
to pay a price for not doing what you didn't want to do, because there's still a price to be paid.
Yeah, there is. And I think all of us have to kind of weigh that in our minds, because for some of us, the security of having a steady job or whatever, maybe that's more important than following some, maybe undefined dream or whatever it is. And that's great. But I think sometimes you have to have that kind of serious internal conversation with yourself. And it helps, of course, to get input from those around you. But in the end, it's your decision. It's your life. And that's a lot of times what I try and tell my students. In the history and political science department, we get a lot of majors who have transferred from something else. So we're having that conversation a lot of a student sometimes in crisis of saying, well, I came here for civil engineering, or I came here to be a physicist or something like that, but it's not my thing, and I love history and I want to do, and so we're constantly having that conversation. And what's really interesting is to see, you show them this chart of all these careers you could have in history, and it's just many, 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 many dozens, not just like what I do as an academic, but that's just the tip of the iceberg. And then you see the light bulb go off, like, oh, I can translate these skills to other things. I had a really interesting conversation once with one of my engineering colleagues. And, he told me, he said, what I teach my students is going to be obsolete in 5 to 6, 7 years. What you teach them is kind of permanent and timeless, because it's these sort of communication skills, analytical skills, and of course, very important nowadays, like critical thinking, all this information that's around, what's real, what isn't, and how you figure out what you think about things, whether it's public policy or whatever else, and so data analysis and all these things are going to translate to a lot of different kinds of careers, and you need that skill set. So for my STEM students, I'm teaching them that, not just the nuts and bolts of what happened in history, but all these other skills, and of course, obviously for history students as well.
What courses do you teach over at Missouri S&T, and which one is your favorite?
Yeah, I teach a range of courses. I teach U.S. history since 1877. It's one of our basic survey courses. Every student has to have an American history credit. So that obviously would fulfill your U.S. history credit. And then I teach a range of upper level classes, the American Military Experience, which is like a broader survey of American military history. I teach Civil War and Reconstruction. What else? U.S. in World War II, U.S. in Vietnam, and then a course both of which I designed and implemented. And then a course I designed called Americans in Combat, Modern Americans in Combat, and it focuses on World War II through the present. So that's like a reflection of my own research. My favorite one is generally the U.S. in World War II. Because yes, I'm a military historian. World War II is my biggest area of emphasis, and just to have a course on World War II it could be an enormous undertaking. So even winnowing it down to my particular area, U.S. in World War II, and making it an upper level American history credit, there's so much to cover, and it's just fascinating. And the neat thing too is that for all these classes, but especially for the World War II class, students are so interested, most of them, and they want to be there and they want to learn, and they've kind of brought some of their own ideas to it as well, and it keeps me fresh. It's always good to keep learning and get new perspectives. So that probably is my ultimate favorite, I would say.
As a professional in history, what kind of value do you see yourself bringing to students or peers who are engaging with you by reading your books or listening to your presentations?
Yeah, I think I hope that I kind of broaden their perspective on the world, and maybe give them a little sense of what it has meant and what it continues to mean to fight in a war. What that really is like, at least from the perspective of reading about it and learning about it, I guess, scholastically. I really think that can open up someone's world to say, oh my God, this is what that really meant. Here are the larger implications of American involvement in World War II. Here's how it affected our society. Here's how it continues. You begin to kind of, sort of wake up to some of the consequences of all these wars. And so I hope people gain some, larger perspective from that. I hope that there are some lessons learned about what kind of mistakes were made in the past, and maybe that informs what what kind of decisions people make in the future, or at least how they look at the world. I really think too, beyond just the sort of nuts and bolts content. What I always hope my students especially get is a kind of a analytical viewpoint to the world, of saying, okay, well, here's how we've approached this problem of American logistics in World War II, and here's how they dealt with it then. Here's how they succeeded. Here's how they failed. Here's the lessons I draw from that. And so I can take that analytical viewpoint and I can apply it to any problem, whether it's insurance or whether it's, some sort of startup that you've got, whether it's an engineering problem or whatever it is. It's the same kind of approach. And, so well, it's a range of things. If we're talking about like the sort of broader public in reading my books, I really do hope that my books have helped educate whoever reads them about the realities of combat, about the realities of modern warfare, and how that continues to be so incredibly relevant. And I don't think that's ever going to change. I really don't.
Can you give some examples of ways where it's relevant today, what you're studying from the past?
Yeah, just this week we had on campus a kind of a panel discussion about the Afghanistan withdrawal, which of course is obviously front and center in our news of the last few months, and certainly not a pleasant story. So we had Major Matt Burmeister from the ROTC program sort of give the military science approach to the problem. We had Steve Corns from I think from engineering management give the kind of logistical sense of, okay, here's how American bases operate in Afghanistan. Here were the problems with how you're going to withdraw equipment and fuel and all this kind of stuff. And my perspective was, and a kind of an historical base point of a comparison of the withdrawal from Vietnam with the one from Afghanistan, and what was similar and what was different. Because I teach a course on Vietnam. I do a lot of research work on Vietnam, and so I really think in that sense you could immediately see, okay, here's the most immediate historical scenario that is relevant, that then also can kind of broaden your understanding. I think there's a tendency a lot of times when we look at modern history to say, okay, well, it's always repeating itself, and sometimes that's true, sometimes it's not. So I think it's useful to look at even similar events and realize, okay, what translate, what doesn't. So I think all of us would like to have a better understanding of the Afghan withdrawal and now what it's going to mean for us going forward. Well, I think when we look at the Vietnam withdrawal in the mid 70s, and what going forward, we can see a lot, and we can avoid some mistakes. That's always my hope.
Hopefully, right? Yes.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a bit about what topics Fire and Fortitude and Island Infernos are about and what time period they cover?
Yeah, Fire and Fortitude covers 1941 to 1943. So the book begins, the action really begins with the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. Now, I have an introduction in there to kind of give you a framework for the Pacific War and for where the Army fits, and some of the kind of longer term, and again, broad pattern analysis and all this kind of stuff that you see there. But yeah, we begin with Pearl Harbor, and then Fire and Fortitude ends with the invasion of Macon, a small island in the Central Pacific in November 1943. So in between, you just got this incredible scope of human story of a terrible campaign in the Philippines in 1941 and 42, the American POW experience, fighting in New Guinea, the New Guinea jungles, which is just a brutal kind of experience. And I think something that I think has also really been overlooked in what's often historians call like the body of work that's been done. They call it historiography. In other words, here's the history of the history, what people have written and what their take has been, and, what kind of sources they use, all that kind of thing. And I think it's really been overlooked, the U.S. presence in Australia and what that's meant for the U.S.-Australian relationship ever since. About 1 million Americans passed through Australia in the course of World War II, and that had consequences for both countries. So I go into that pretty deeply, and as I said, the POW experience is just brutal. So that's the scope of Fire and Fortitude. Island Infernos will cover 1944, because what's happened by 1944, of course, the U.S. war effort has amped up. The Army's gotten bigger. There's a lot more battles. There's a lot more going on. The U.S. is the Allies are winning the war. And so there's just more to cover. You need a whole book really to cover 1944, because so much is happening. So we begin with the invasion of Kwajalein, which is like late January 1944. And then we end with the Battle of Leyte, which is one of the biggest American battles of World War II, and yet again, kind of relatively overlooked. The invasion force that the U.S. Employs at Leyte is actually larger than the American complement for the Normandy invasion earlier that year, believe it or not. And the U.S. ground forces are larger. And the battle is, while not quite as big as Normandy, it's certainly in the neighborhood, So and again, in between, we just see, so many battles playing out that I cover. But really, I go more deeply into issues of race, into issues of logistics and disease. The Pacific War is an interspecies war. Because you have so many malaria-bearing mosquitoes, and you're constantly dealing with that. You have scrub typhus outbreaks. You've got the atabrine is a drug that is really helps control malaria, and yet you get resistance to take it, and so you can immediately see, you're like, oh my gosh, here's a parallel that I can look to in the 21st century and see, here's how we combat disease. Here's where there's problems with people worrying about the pharmaceutical end of it, and trying to figure out public policy wise how you're going to deal with all this. And then there's all the interplay of the senior commanders in general. There's a lot of lessons of leadership, from Island Infernos, from both books, but especially from Island Infernos with MacArthur and his generals. And so yeah, the scope of that book is 1944, and then the third volume will cover 1945, which of course is the end of the war.
Wonderful. Could you give us an idea about the combat by maybe comparing the kind of forces that were fighting in the islands, the Japanese forces, with the kind of forces that Americans would have encountered in Europe, like Western Europe?
Yeah, I think that the Germans, just as a general rule, were better equipped with artillery than were the Japanese. The Americans have a tremendous advantage in artillery, especially by 1944, and you see that play out in Island Infernos in that book. But what's different between the Germans and the Japanese, to some extent, is the willingness of the individual soldier to fight you to the death. Most of the Japanese have that perspective of not surrendering, fighting to the death. And so that really means that any battle is probably going to linger on, because you're not going to have a situation as you do, say, in like continental littoral operations in Europe, where the Germans can retreat, or those who have been bypassed or whatever surrender to you or whatever. You're not really going to have that much with the Japanese. I compare it, these sort of island invasions and the bitterness of the combat, to like the shards of a broken mirror. You've policed up most of the jagged shards, but there's always these little pieces out there, and you're seeing that in many invasions. Like Leyte is really a prime example, where you really have broken the back of most Japanese resistance. You've won the battle, but there's still Japanese resisting, who are survivors out in the jungle here and there, who you have to deal with. And then the question becomes, can we bypass them? Should we bypass them? How do we do that? And it's also a very difficult conversation for a lot of American commanders. So like in New Guinea, in 1944, you have these leapfrog invasions that the Americans do, and they sort of outflank the Japanese, and they're hoping to kind of starve them out, and this leads to some very ferocious battles where the Japanese are desperately trying to fight back and get out of these sort of bypass pockets and whatever. But when they don't, they're basically wandering around in this jungle wilderness, dying out there. And I found one of the things I think is very dramatic about this series that I think is generally, again, tend to be overlooked, is the Japanese perspective of the individual soldier. And they kept a lot of diaries that the Allies captured and translated, that I was able to access. And so some of these are from guys who were just dying out in the New Guinea jungle, and Australians or Americans found their diaries later or whatever, and you can just see this sort of degradation of a person as they starve to death, and just their perspective as they're wandering around. It's incredibly tragic. But it also, I think, is important to humanize the so-called enemy. And you really see the Japanese as every bit as human as the Americans, and it brings home to you, I think, the sort of larger tragedy that this war ever happened in the first place. And it really does give you a sense of what it costs both sides.
What has been the most challenging part of researching and writing these books?
Really the kind of sheer logistics of that, because this is a broad scope that I've taken on. And so that means a lot of archival work in many different places, whether it's the National Archives or the Hoover Institution, or else just personal interviews, that I may have done over the years, or taking account all the published accounts. And I mean, just this vast kind of corpus that's out there of information, and making sure that you access as much of it as possible to give a fair perspective, because the best history, I think, takes into account everything that could possibly be useful, and then kind of starts to winnow that down. But it all has to be very heavily documented. I mean, my endnotes in these books, for every one endnote that's in there, there could easily be 50 others, because it could be every sentence, because I want to make sure everything is documented, and that has taken years of either travel to archives or sort of organization of the material. And I mean, that is in actually doing the writing. That is the biggest challenge, is that you're like, okay, I want to make sure I'm taking into account all the relevant sources, I'm giving you the fairest account of what's going on at Kwajalein, or or in New Guinea, or whatever we're talking about, anything that could be pertinent. And that takes a lot of time to kind of put that in place, analyze it, figure out how to construct a narrative out of that. What I would compare it to is I've done a lot of documentaries, and what I've noticed, and what the filmmakers often told me, they spend like the majority of their time setting up the shot rather than doing the actual interview or whatever. And I think this is the sort of literary version of that. You spend tons of time like getting all your sources ready and setting it up, and how you're going to approach writing 10 paragraphs, you know what I mean? And so that can be very time consuming and a little bit challenging in that respect, but I guess that's the fun of it too. Yeah.
So you've really kind of, in a way, been writing this book for many, many years before you even set pen to paper.
Absolutely. Yeah. This has been for well over a decade that I've been working on this book that has become 3 books in a way, just because the scope of the story is so vast, so, because, I had been thinking about it for a number of years and gathering material, digitally and otherwise. And then part of deciding on a topic is figuring out the feasibility, whether you can really go and find good primary sources, and whether you can access it, and whether it's going to, tell us something new, give us something original, because otherwise what's really the point? So yeah, I mean, that is just probably going to take a lot of time for something with this scope, and to make sure it's within your skill set. There are other really, I think, much more accomplished scholars who have incredible linguistic skills and can tell you sort of the deep dive into, say, like, German war policy or something, because they're deep into the German archives and all that. I'm an American historian, and so my perspective is sort of the U.S. experience, and how we fought these wars, and how that's affected us, and who does it and why, and all these kind of takeaways we can get from it. So, so you have to have this kind of very real kind of humility as to what your limitations are. And of course, mine are many, so what I'm giving you is the sort of larger sense of the Army's role in this whole thing, but seeing how it fits within the larger context of the Pacific War and the war overall.
How difficult is it? Because World War II is one of those history topics where there are so many books on it, there are so many experts, there are so many researchers. Yep. Is it challenging to say something new and something that's so exhaustively written?
It really is. And I mean, and that is always the thing. And especially if you're around a while like I am. I mean, if you've seen the same thing over and over again, that's pretty boring. And so to me, I mean, and then of course, that's what any real scholar is supposed to be doing in their field, whether it's chem engineering, or whether it's history, or whether it's, English and tech com or something. I mean, you need to be contributing something new to your field. And that's one of the reasons why I got so excited about the story of the Army in the Pacific, because it was just so incredibly overlooked, that there was this sense, and still is, in our kind of popular memory of the war, that the Marines did all the ground fighting, that it was sort of the Navy's war, and the Army fought in Europe. Well, the Army that fought in the Pacific is the 3rd largest we've ever sent overseas to fight a war, ever. And it did the vast majority of the ground fighting. And this doesn't take anything away from the Marines, who were remarkable, but there just weren't very many of them. And the Army then was designed not just to do the fighting, but for all this other stuff, the logistics, the engineering, the public policy, the civil affairs, the guerrilla operations. I mean, on and on and on it goes, medical, so these are in and of themselves all vast stories. And so if you're a World War II historian like me, and you've been sort of studying this a long time, you're like, oh my God, it sort of opens up your eyes. Like, this is a completely new kind of vista here. And that's exciting, of course, on a lot of levels, because it's with World War II, there's parts of it that are just such plowed ground. An example I'd give you is the atomic bomb thing, controversy or whatever. I mean, that to me is a horse that's been beaten over so many times. And I don't know that there's a lot new to say in terms of new source material or whatever. With the Army in the Pacific, there's so much source material I used in there that had never really been used or never been consulted or whatever. And that's kind of how you want it. One thing, though, that's kind of cool, even with some events that are pretty well known, like, say, the Normandy invasion or the Battle of Normandy, there's still new information coming out in the analysis, in the interpretation of these events, that you'll have some of the good scholars come along and say, well, okay, but what about this perspective? And sometimes that's informed by current events, by whichever way the world leads. So, for instance, there's probably, I think, much better work done now on race and culture and public memory of World War II than there would have been 40 years ago or 50 years ago, when historians just weren't really concerned with these kind of analytical approaches to it. And so a lot of times that's how history is changing, even World War II history that's been, done over, some of it to death. And so that's what you're always looking for, is that original side.
What do you hope people are going to take away from books like Fire and Fortitude, and then your upcoming book coming out in November 2021, Island Infernos?
Yeah, I really hope that they can identify with it, especially if these are Americans reading the book, but it doesn't necessarily have to be that. But I hope they can identify with the people they're reading about. They're really not that different than we are. They just happen to live in that time. And they happen to be people who were sent to the jungles of New Guinea or who fought in the Philippines or in the Battle of Saipan or something, and the kind of challenges they faced, and whether you can kind of relate to that a little bit, that I hope that it affects you on that human level of saying, wow, this is what that really meant. Here is how it's now relevant to me. The war that was fought there, it shaped my world in these ways, and it still could. I really hope that people kind of have that takeaway. And of course, a number of my readers are people who are, of course, quite into World War II. And I'm not just saying like scholars. I'm saying, just everyday folks who read a lot about World War II and are very into it. And there's a lot of people that fit that category, and I think that's great. I hope that they read it and say, I really never knew much about that. I never thought about that aspect of World War II, and now that has sort of completely changed my perspective. That was what was exciting to me about Fire and Fortitude, because when it received that kind of recognition, that's precisely what it said about it, that this was a new original contribution that kind of revises our thinking. And that is, in a way, what you always hope people can take away from it.
And where can people check out your upcoming book, Island Infernos? Where can they connect with you online?
I've got a website called www.johncmcmanus.com, and it's got links to my email addresses. I've got a Facebook page, John C. McManus, as well. And of course, they can pre-order it on Amazon or any other e-tailer. And obviously, when it comes out on November 9th, any bricks and mortar bookstore. And that's still, believe it or not, where a tremendous amount of literary commerce still happens, which is cool, because I think we need those kind of pavilions of places to go for, there's so many of us that love to go to a place where there's books. Here I'm telling you, in the library perspective, there still is that. And the digital side is great. Fire and Fortitude, Island Infernos, we've got all the versions, we've got the Kindle version, we're going to have Audible, and I think that's really great. But I also think it's neat to have the book in your hands and to have that kind of communal experience sometimes of going to a bookstore or a library or whatever, and just going and seeing what grabs you, and it's peaceful, it's good, it's reflective. And so, yeah, I mean, Island Infernos is available through any kind of forum you could imagine, which is great. And it's gotten, so far, terrific advanced reviews. So we're excited about that. And I hope that people, enjoy it when it comes out. It's about a month away. It's hard to believe.
Do you have anything that you're really, as we kind of conclude up here, do you have anything that you're really proud about? Something specific from the upcoming book, Island Infernos, that you're really excited to share with people?
Yeah. There's a number of things.
I mentioned there isn't a book that size.
It is, and maybe I'm too proud, but I think that I'm able to explore the dynamic of MacArthur and his two key generals, Walter Kruger and Robert Eichelberger, who are really overlooked in terms of their historical importance and their importance in a command setting in World War II. I'm able to explore it on a level that I don't know has been done before. And I think you really get a sense of these guys and their personalities and the various people they work with and their staffs and how they interact. And see, that's part of what I'm talking about, that, you don't have to be like a hardcore World War II wonk or fanatic or something to sort of read that and say, that dynamic kind of translates to what I'm dealing with in the workplace right now, and gosh, I have a boss like that, like MacArthur, or as if anyone could be like MacArthur, but you know what I mean.
Yeah.
Right. It's like, I've got the boss that I can kind of relate to that, or I've got subordinates who act that way. And so I think there's just so many really cool kind of real world scenarios you see playing out under the tremendous stress of war, that you can read and say, man, I really sort of relate to that. I feel like I know that person. I feel like I can walk into the room, shake their hand, and say, yeah, I've known you for my whole life, because you've been brought to life that way. And to do that, I think it takes that kind of immersive primary source research, like I was telling you. So I really am really proud of that, because I don't know that that's been done before. There have been like a biography of General Kruger, many of MacArthur, of course, tons. What I'm talking about is seeing them in the context of this larger narrative that's always moving forward of the war and how it's unfolding in 1944. Here's how you see these guys and see them sort of evolving and their relationships evolving and devolving, whatever happens to be. And I think it's just a really compelling human story. And so I am proud of that, because I don't write history just for 10 other scholars or something. I write it as a relatable thing for everybody. I think that's one of the cool things about history. It's for everybody. I mean, it belongs to all of us. It's for everybody, and it's for each of us to explore in the way that interests us, and that's great.
Awesome. And do you have anything that you'd like to add to our conversation today?
No, I think I've prattled on enough about all this, but as you can see, once you wind me up, I get going. I think I just have a tremendous passion for this, and I guess I just think it's important on a lot of levels. So I hope that that it just gets people to kind of step back and think about whatever history interests them and maybe what they can learn from it.